research expertise is in Mollusca, and he has worked extensively on the history, taxonomy, and systematics of South Asian mollusks. He also works collaboratively as a quaternary malacologist using non-marine mollusks to develop biostratigraphical models and paleoecological paleoclimatic reconstructions. We're going to just have to wait a minute until we're ready to go. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tinta. Apologies that I'm not there with you in person. I had a lot of problems getting my visa, so I'm still here in the UK, sadly. And apologies for the technical problems this morning. I still have issues with my internet connection at home here, so I'm using my mobile phone. So I'm coming through the 4G network, so if there are any glitches, then I apologize in advance. And also apologies for not seeing the earlier talks, because of course the time difference here means that it was rather early in the morning for me to get to the morning sessions. But I'm hopefully going to sort of follow on from John Ablett's talk. John was talking about Henry Havisham Godwin Austen and his contributions to malacology, and he and I and Fred, who I can see is he was in the audience. Richard Preece from the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge have been working extensively over the last few years on sort of historical collections-based research, and particularly the last sort of 5 or 6 years, even more, have been taken up with an analysis of the type material described by William Benson. I'm not going to talk about Benson today. I'm going to talk about William Theobald, who I think is the sort of important link between Benson and Godwin Austen. So I should start sharing my slides, really. It's probably not doing these things in person. Here we go. See whether this works. Is that clear to see?
Yes, we can. Would you put it back in the presenter mode now? Bottom right, next to the Zoom bar.
This one?
Oh,
this one here.
That's the one.
That's
Yes.
the one. Yes, there we go. So yes, I'm going to talk about William Theobald and also some related work that came through. So a lot of these sort of projects sort of build on each other, and having worked extensively on the Benson material and delved very deeply into various archives to understand where his type material was and how we could evaluate it and make images of it available to the research community, we kind of moved on to other members of that malacological network. So Theobald, in my opinion, is fascinating and important in character in Indian and Asian malacology more broadly. And I'd also like to talk about the sort of major publication on Indian molluscs that was published in the 1870s, Conchologia indica, because I've been doing a lot of research into the dates. It was published, and there are some issues there with those publication dates that need rectifying and has an impact on a lot of the taxes that were introduced in that book. Let me make this move on. There we go. So yes, just to outline what I'm going to say, hopefully, to hide the Zoom control because I can't see my screen properly. Can I do that? Yes, there we go. So I'm just going to provide a brief biography of William Theobald and outline his contributions to Asian malacology, talk briefly about his collection, how it came to be in the NHM, Godwin Austen being a major character in that transaction, and then, yes, discuss the publication dates of Conchologia indica, which is arguably Theobald's best known malacological work, although he has published in other areas. Here we have a nice plate of some cyclophorids from Conchologia indica, which was beautifully illustrated. And here is Theobald as a member of the Geological Survey of India, quite a famous photograph of various important naturalists there. So Theobald He was a polymath. He worked as a geologist as his main occupation, but he was also a naturalist who contributed to a wide variety of different animal groups, and also dabbled to a certain extent with botany, and an antiquarian. He collected and published mainly on molluscs, although he also did quite a lot of work on herpetology, and is very well known as a source of reptile and amphibian specimens. He also described quite a few lizard and snake species. He looked at birds and their nests and eggs. He didn't publish much on this, but he again provided a large number of specimens to other naturalists. And by the end of his career, when he was working up a major work on the natural history of Burma, he also got heavily into botany, although he was rather an amateur at that particular discipline, and so he was criticised quite a lot by other botanists at the time. He was the second person to record Stone Age prehistoric artifacts in India, after his colleague at the GSI, Valentine Ball. And as I said, he worked extensively in India, but later he became synonymous really with his exploits in Burma. And he really established the foundations for natural history research in that country. And when he finally retired in the 1880s, he published on coins. He got very interested in sort of more cultural aspects and literature, and sort of left natural history behind. So as I said, Theobald is the link really between the pioneering malacologists working in India and Godwin Austen. So the most notable characters in the early stages of the discipline of malacology are William Henry Benson, who I'm sure many of you have heard about. Hopefully had a look at our biography published in Tropical Natural History last year. Benson was a East India Company civil servant who went out to India in the early 1820s, and he introduced over 470 molluscan taxa. Huge contribution to the mostly non-marine fauna of mainly India, Sri Lanka, and Burma. And also, I should mention in this sort of pioneering group, Thomas Hutton, who was a captain in the East India Company Army, friend of Benson's, and he introduced far fewer species than Benson, only 21 species described by Hutton himself. But the reason I mention him is because both Hutton and Benson were, I suppose you could call them amateurs. They weren't zoologists by training, although they were, by the end of their careers, well known as taxonomists. But the reason they sort of were hesitant in their early publications to add names to the new species they were clearly discovering was that they just had no access to published literature in order to check that their taxa were new. And both of them wrote about this reticence in their early papers, saying that they just didn't know whether it was a new species or not, so they didn't want to add new names to the literature unnecessarily. Very responsible attitude. And Godwin Austen, when he began his own research career in molluscs in the 1860s, he records in his address to the Malacological Society of London in the 1890s that it was Hutton's library that he was permitted to use initially, and that was essential for him, essentially becoming a malacologist, having access to those books. So Hutton has a sort of link there, bringing in Godwin Austen and that link to the earlier malacological workers. There we go. So all of this research sort of revolves around identifying and establishing the importance of these malacological research networks. So many of these names cross over between different people. So you put Benson at the epicenter. Lots of these people are related to material that he described. But equally, if you switch the emphasis to Theobald, then many of the same names also supplied material to him, and he described species based on material they collected. And you can see, obviously, there's a sort of historical structure to this. It's all very much predicated around the organisation of the East India Company and later the British government in India. Obviously, there were the personal members of the networks, household servants, none of whom were named, but often paid to go and collect material for Benson in particular, possibly the same for Theobald. Documentation is patchy in all of these things when we look into the archival materials. Then there were also doctors, missionaries, members of the armed forces, other naturalists, and importantly, as far as Theobald's concerned, his friends and colleagues at the Geological Survey of India, notably Thomas Oldham and Francis Fedden, who did a lot of exploration of the Salween Valley in Burma and provided a huge amount of material from there. And also very important characters are the two Blandford brothers and various members of the GSI. We've got Ferdinand Stolitzka here, and Theobald is there. And to show you the importance of Theobald in Benson's network and the reason why he was an obvious candidate for sort of a follow-up project, this is just a breakdown of the of Benson's taxa and who provided the type material to him. And of course, Theobald is up there as by far and away the most prolific supplier of material to Benson. So we have 96 species described by Benson founded on Theobald specimens, over 20 more than he collected himself, and way over double anybody else who managed to send material to Benson over his long career. So, you know, Theobald not only describing his own material, but also prolific supplier of material to other important malacological taxonomists. So here's a brief chronology of Theobald's life. He was actually born in Marylebone in London. There's not been very much written about Theobald, surprisingly, in terms of a biography. There was a bit of a brief biography published as part of a botanical review of his botanical contributions. And in that publication, there was a lot of speculation as to whether Theobald was American, because he tended to use the epithet junior after his name in most publications. In actual fact, having delved into some archives, he wasn't American. He was born in London. His birthplace wasn't recorded anywhere online. But he used junior because his father was also William Theobald and was also resident in Calcutta and a member of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And so to distinguish himself from his father in those publications, he adopted the suffix junior, and he kept it for the rest of his life, even after his father had died. So not American, but a Londoner. He came out to India in the late 1840s and immediately joined some of these embryonic surveys that were being undertaken, initially with David Hiram Williams, who died of malaria within a few months of Theobald joining him, and then transferred to McClellan's Coal Committee. And the Coal Committee was one of the most important predecessors of the Geological Survey of India, which was formed by the amalgamation of the Coal Committee and some other embryonic surveys that had been established. And so Theobald began his work there as a survey superintendent. He was then transferred to Burma, where he took over the big surveys going on as the Tenasserim and Pegu provinces. And he laboured on these for a long time, over 20 years. And had a brief period in Calcutta in the late 1850s, where he rearranged and catalogued the collections of the Asiatic Society. And this is probably where his sort of taste for shells and other specimens was really brought to the fore, because it's after this point he starts to publish much more prolifically on these topics, and sends a lot of material back to Benson and other taxonomists. In the 1860s, 1867, he came back to England on his first furlough to England since he left in the 1840s, so 20 years after he first left the UK. And it was then that he met Sylvanus Hanley and proposed the writing of Conchologia indica, which I'll come on to in the second half of this talk. 1870, the first part of it was published. And by the 1880s, he retired, including his sort of natural history career with his new edition of Burma, People and Productions, and then sold his shell collection to the NHM. And I believe we paid £72 for it in 1888, which is about £13,000 today. And it was Godwin Austen who went down to Theobald's house in Devon to go through the collection, pull out all the important specimens that he thought the museum should have, and arrange for them to be packaged up and sent back up to London. So again, another link to Godwin Austen there. And then finally, in 1908, Theobald died, and I'll come on to Godwin Austen and the legacy of Theobald's career towards the end of my talk. So one of Theobald's most important early contributions to malacology was to go to Calcutta and go through the collections of the Asiatic Society that existed at that time. So this was published as a catalogue in 1860, and then of course updated by Geoffrey Neville in his two-part hand list. And Theobald, noted at the time that there was already difficulties in accessing material, and so both the Theobald catalogue and the Neville catalogue hand list are critical when you're coming to evaluate things and trying to find out where type material might be in the Indian collections, because they usually mention the relevant shells, even if they're not labelled as such today. So again, an important early contribution. The Asiatic Society material, as everyone should know, I assume knows, were subsumed into the Indian Museum collections and then transferred to the ZSI in 1916. So there's a direct link between what exists now in the collections in Calcutta and what Theobald saw in the 1860s. And this the breakdown of Theobald's taxa that he introduced. Apart from what I've already mentioned in terms of the number of specimens he provided to other people, he described 97 of his own gastropods, 8 of which he described jointly with Ferdinand Stelitzka in a paper, and 15 species of bivalves. And on top of that, there were the 64 taxa that were introduced as new species in Conchologia indica, 51 gastropods and 13 bivalves. And of those gastropods, quite a lot of his material were slugs, which is quite unusual. He kept a lot of wet specimens. He was a very prepared field operator. And so his wet material was entirely given to Godwin Austen rather than the museum, although it made it into the museum eventually as part of the Godwin Austen collection. So I think John gave a breakdown of Godwin Austen's material, and there's an awful lot of Theobald specimens represented amongst that wet collection. And not quite as successful as Godwin Austen in terms of his taxa remaining valid. So he described quite a few varieties and subspecies, as did Hanley, of course. So about 30% of Theobald's taxa are now either invalid or synonymized. But he did describe some very important things. And also, as a departure from those pioneers I mentioned earlier, Benson and Hutton, Theobald was, he habitually sort of illustrated quite a lot of his specimens. Not all of them by any extent, but a lot more of his species were at least accompanied by a slightly more detailed description and a figure, which is very useful for us trying to evaluate them now. The geographical coverage, Theobald worked, these maps borrowed from the Benson monograph. Still trying to generate some new maps for the Theobald work, but he worked a lot up here in the sort of, I don't know if my pointer is visible on the screen, but up here in the Punjab and in Kashmir, so sort of northwestern India, and sort of some other areas down here, Katawar and Gurnar were also high on Theobald's list. But most extensively, he worked over in Burma, especially around the areas of Mulman and Pegu, but he also collected down in Magui and Tavoy. So a lot of that sort of coast running down towards the south of Burma was the key hunting ground for Theobald. That brings us on really to his relationship with Sylvanus Hanley and the production of Conchologia indica. Theobald met Hanley in 1867 and proposed the writing of Conchologia Indica. And the understanding was that Hanley, based in the UK, would get the book written and would get the illustrations produced by G.B. Sowerby II. And in exchange for doing that side of things, Theobald would supply as many of the specimens as possible and allow Hanley to keep anything that wasn't a holotype. Now, that's important to remember when it comes to evaluating where the type material is, because we know that Theobald explicitly wrote in a couple of places that he demanded the holotypes returned to him. So whenever there is mention of a single specimen, we need to look to Theobald's collection. If there's no mention of a single specimen, then there might be syntypes in more than one collection that need to be considered. Hanley is quite well known as a conchologist of dubious repute in some ways. He's known for various pieces of work, including photographic conchology, which was the first work to use photographs to illustrate specimens. But these were, of course, black and white, and Hanley then had them painted over. So the purpose of the photograph is rather unclear because you can't actually see the photographs in the final book. And ironically, despite having done that, there is no known photograph of Hanley himself. He borrowed many specimens for the works he did from other people, including Benson, and he described them, sometimes using the manuscript names appended by those people. But he was most notorious for removing the labels and locality data from the specimens that were lent to him. And you can see that in some of these specimens in the collection in London, there's notes written by people like Blandford, William Blandford, and Godwin Austen, saying things like Union marginalis, locality, ? Lost by Hanley. And the bottom one here, it says, this specimen was lent to Hanley, who has thrown away the label with locality. So Hanley's a bit of a menace when it comes to our work, trying to evaluate these type materials, because he tended to sort of vandalize the documentation. Nevertheless, Hanley and Theobald got to work on Conchologia Indica, and Hanley started work on the plates. He also used the collections, apart from Theobald's collection that I just described, on sending material mainly from Burma. He described and illustrated shells from the Benson collection and from the Blandford Brothers collections. They were the main 4 collections used, as well as his own. And he also came to the BM, as it was then, the British Museum, and looked at type material in the collection there, which a lot of it was in the Cumming collection, and some of the specimens have been described by Louis Pfeiffer. And sorry, I should go back one page actually. So just to point out as well that Conchologia Indica was published in 8 parts between 1870 and 1876. And this has been slightly problematic because the dates of those parts haven't been very clear. So I've been put together a new schedule for its publication, which I think is very useful, and I hope you find it interesting. So the parts were first dated. This problem was noted relatively early on, and Bainey Prashad, who was the first president of the ZSI, he proposed the first scheme for the publication of Conchologia Indica. Now, Prashad only had to hand 2 critical copies of the work that provided dating evidence. One was William Blandford's copy, and Blandford had written the years of publication on some of the surviving wrappers for the individual parts. But then he had the book bound with the text all together and the plates all together. So we had no idea of how they were originally issued in terms of pagination. He also had the copy that used to belong to the malacologist Philip Dortzenberg, and that copy had been bound with the plates and the text as issued. And so you've got an impression of how these things went together. Now, the book was also published as a complete copy in 1876, which had no indication of any of the earlier publication dates for the individual parts. And so Prashad, when he looked at other library copies, could find no additional data to help him with his scheme. And so you can see that he couldn't separate parts 1 and 2 based on the Blandford and Dortzenberg copies he had to hand, and equally he had trouble separating parts 5 and 6. But the Prashad scheme has been in place since 1927, so nearly 100 years, and is essentially correct. But there are some issues with those amalgamated groups, and the reason I came to examine this was because I noticed that a couple of species I was trying to evaluate had sort of very vague publication dates, and there was something to be refined there. So, taking some new lines of evidence, I've been to look at library copies in various libraries here in the UK, the British Library, the Museum of Wales in Cardiff. There's a copy in Cambridge, which used to belong to Robert McAndrew, and there's a copy in the University College London Library that used to belong to the Malacological Society of London. And of course, there's also 4 copies that have been digitized and placed now on Biodiversity Heritage Library and other online resources, including Godwin Austen's copy, which is full of his personal annotations, and that is the copy now in Harvard, and you can look at that on BHL. Other evidence for the publication dates of Conch indica has come from advertisements placed by the publisher, Lovell Reeve & Co. in London magazines like the Athenaeum and Publishers Circular, and also the dates that they were received by libraries in India. So notably the Asiatic Society of Bengal and the Geological Survey of India published their library acquisitions in their respective proceedings. So one final thing is to consider the travel time for those works to arrive in India. So if they're published in London at a certain point in time, it takes about 6 weeks to get a parcel from London to Calcutta. And so you have to add that sort of lag time in to working out when it's probably published for it to have arrived in Calcutta to be registered in the library of whichever institution. So for each part now, we have a sort of evaluation of its publication date. And that leads to, a slide in the wrong order here. That leads to a variety of dates changing. So obviously Prashad scheme here on the left. And what I've been able to do is separate the text and plates more accurately, and also provide more accurate dates to the month, really, based on various lines of evidence I just mentioned. Some of the data has come from very obvious things like date stamps of the British Museum copy, and now in the British Library. They stamp their dates. They stamp the dates of things were arriving in the library collection directly onto the volume, but not all of them were stamped in this way. Other evidence has come from sort of surrounding circumstantial information. So, for example, the where are we? Let's see, controls. Yes, there we go. So parts 5 and 6, for example, in the Prashad scheme, are dated as being published in 1874, but Robert McAndrew's copy has all the parts up to part 5, and McAndrew died in 1873, and so it'd be rather strange for him to have received publications that came out a year after his death. And indeed, when you redate the parts based on the new evidence, part 5 actually comes out in the 1st of November 1872, about 6 months before McAndrew died. So all of this evidence linked together means that we have to review the dates of the taxa that were introduced in Conchologia indica, and this is a table, goes across 2 slides, that shows the new species that were introduced, and they are all species rather than genera. Some of them are also subspecies, and you can see that obviously there are some in green where the dates, as suggested by the Prashad scheme, are correct, and then there is a certain amount of refinement required for the ones in red, where the new scheme brings publication date forward, usually rather earlier than suggested in the earlier schemes. And that's fine for most of these because they were already accepted as taxa introduced by Hanley and Theobald. But there are a few taxa that actually then need to be changed more fundamentally. So Hanley in particular had a habit of publishing what he called manuscript names of other people. So many of the new taxa introduced in this work were attributed to Benson, to William Blandford, and to others. And in most cases, the publication of Conchologia indica did not precede the descriptions of those authors. However, in a couple of cases, for species that were then published in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London, which notoriously came out later than stated, the last part, mainly part 7 and 8 of Conchologia indica, do have priority. Now, this means that one of Godwin Austen's species, Helix, it's Helix serica in Godwin Austen, Plectropilus serica, but Hanley mangled the name and called it Helix sericata. But this has priority over Godwin Austen's own description, and therefore the name has to be transferred to Hanley and Theobald. So it's one to take off John's totals for Godwin Austen's taxa. And then also there are these 4 species that Hanley published in 1876 in the PZSL, which again he beat himself into press in part 8 of Cong indica, and so those taxa also need to have a Hanley and Theobald authorship appended to them. And there's a couple of examples here. So Endothyralis sericata, Hanley and Theobald, which is no longer Godwin Austen, and Cyclophorus ophis, which we found the holotype in the Theobald collection. And so just to sort of summarize this talk, I suppose, by the early 20th century, it had been sort of widely acknowledged that the naturalists typified by Benson, Theobald, and Godwin Austen were in decline, and indeed Theobald's obituary described him as one of the rapidly dwindling body of all-round naturalists. And Godwin Austen was described at that time as the last active member of the band of Indian malacologists that had included all of those well-known people I've mentioned before. And so, in terms of future directions, I think this kind of work, the Benson Project, and then looking at Theobald and other malacologists working in India, has huge potential for future collaborative projects combining collections data from museums, not just the NHM, where we have an awful lot of stuff, but not by no means all of it. Other UK museums have a lot of material, and of course Indian museums, which we would love to collaborate with more closely on this kind of work. Not just the specimens, but also the archival work. I think finding a lot of this hard-won data relevant to understanding type material is quite difficult to do unless you delve into archives and find nuggets of information that help with understanding. And also the importance of detailed biographical research. So Benson has been done in got a lot of detail, but hopefully following on the footsteps, following on the heels of that will be a biography of Theobald, and finding the hidden histories of people who contributed to that, maybe not in such an easy to see way. Also the importance of critical review of published literature, for correct citation of published names, and just checking that these historical works are well understood. And just as a final thing, just a kind of what's the word? A request, I suppose, for combining the sort of historical collections-based research I've been doing most recently, hopefully with new field work to look for species and improve knowledge of distributions of these species, and indeed whether they still exist, because lots of these taxa exist, as far as I know, in some cases only as the types in our collections, and it'd be nice to know whether they actually are out there somewhere, still living. So apologies for this talk being online rather than in person, and apologies for having to do it over the 4G network. But I'd like to thank the organisers very much for their kind invitation to speak at this meeting. And there's some other acknowledgements there relating to the Benson Project and the work that preceded this talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that great talk. Any questions? I have a question. It's about how did you narrow down the new dates of publication? So you've got quite precise dates. Yeah, as in
Yes, so it's sort of hard to show in the with slides, and it's very sort of here we go. So if you look in the right-hand column of this table, which I'm hopefully going to publish relatively soon. Sorry, let me just hide these meeting controls again. There we go. There we go. So if you look on the right here, the publications in which they placed advertisements came out weekly, and so once they'd advertised a part that is now ready, for example, in the Athenaeum, you can assume that it was available for purchase, and so that gives you some narrowing of the dates. There may be errors involved in that, so I made sure that most of these dates, which are always, I think in most cases, to the end of the month, as the code suggests, you know, if you don't have a precise date, you either date to the end of the month or the end of the year in which you can establish publication. There are a few examples like this part 4 where the 15th of June is given because the library copy is stamped, or a library copy has been stamped with that date. Yes, but usually I've used you know, 3 or 4 different sources of evidence to give as close I can a date of publication in the absence of proper records from the publisher itself.
Okay, so with the date that is stamped by the library.
Yes.
Generally, if the advertisement precedes it, you just go with the advertisement, right?
It depends. So obviously the delivery to the library would also have had a lag time. So I think, you know, date it was appeared in the library is probably slightly later than the date it was genuinely published. But yeah, I mean, usually within the month in which both the stamp and the advertisements appeared, you get the sort of the earliest possible date, I guess, is what I'm going for. Does that make sense? Sorry.
The other question I had was, so when you're going to put this work together in a publication, are you planning to illustrate a lot of the Theobald specimens, even things that he himself didn't necessarily describe? Like, so he provided a lot of material to Benson.
Yes, so the material he provided to Benson,
it's already
a lot of that's already published in the Benson publication. So lots of those specimens have already been imaged. Yes, and I have now most of Theobald's own taxa photographed, and also I have nearly all of the surviving type material for the new taxa in Conchologia indica photographed. So I will hopefully have these ready for publication in the next couple of months and made available. Yes.
Okay. Thanks. That's exciting. And thank you very much for your talk. Thank you to all the audience. That's the end of this session. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
We will now break for a tea coffee session, and please come back at 4 o'clock for the speed talk session, which will then move into the poster session.